Dawn this morning, an RAF base in Cyprus. British commandos' final briefing before boarding a Hercules aircraft that flew into a war zone to rescue British citizens stranded in Khartoum. For 10 days, the advice had been shelter in place while the planning was done. This morning, with another declared ceasefire, the advice changed to, if you've been called, make your way to an airfield north of Khartoum. Then this afternoon it changed again. It became everyone who wants out, get to the airfield now.
The first flight that left took everybody that was at the airfield and eligible is on that flight. There will be more flights this evening and then many more into tomorrow. We're contacting people both directly, but also we've issued out a general call for people. If they can make their way to the airfield, they will then be processed and safely evacuated.
The international effort to evacuate citizens is now in full flow. Just as she was about to leave for the airfield, we managed to get through to British citizen Roa Al-Mubarak in Khartoum. And this is what it feels like just before you step out your front door into a war to get to one of those planes.
From what I've heard from people who went to the airport before me, they said that a lot of people are being killed in the streets. A lot of dead bodies are in the streets.
And when are you going to leave? When are you going to leave for the airfield yourself?
I'm leaving right now.
Are you okay?
I hope to stay safe. I'm leaving my loved ones, and I'm leaving everyone just for the sake of my baby. I hope it will stay though. I hope it will stay.
For people leaving their homes in Khartoum for the British evacuation point, here's what they're up against. Unreliable ceasefire aside, a journey through a war zone. These areas controlled by the Sudan Armed Forces. These neighbourhoods held by the rival Rapid Support Forces. And these the contested zones where fighting has been most intense. It's through this patchwork of conflict you have to travel to make it to the Wadi Sidna airfield, where the British evacuation planes are leaving from. We spoke to one woman who left Khartoum for the Egyptian border 3 days ago, arrived in Cairo today. Like everyone fleeing war, the decision to leave actually consists of hundreds of decisions. And the hardest one, just walking out the door.
Getting into the car was a very hard decision as well, because we knew that, anything could happen along the way. Like just that car journey to get to the bus destination as well was a risky car journey itself. And we also had a lot of family members as well who were down to come down to kind of get on the bus with us. And in that moment, they decided, they turned around and said, we're not going to risk it. That we can hear gunshots, we can hear airstrikes above us. We're not going to risk it. We're going to stay indoors.
As other countries get their people out in their thousands, the hope in Sudan is that international attention remains focused on the tens of thousands of Sudanese on the move. These were the scenes at the border with Chad today. The World Food Programme has told us they're preparing for 100,000 refugees coming through this border alone.
Orica O'Brien, well, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace joins me now from Westminster. Thank you for joining us. How many people do you think you can get out tonight?
Well, I think we've got 2 plane loads that will go out tonight. We can take really who turns up at the moment, and what we've learned from both seeing the German and the French evacuation is, this is first of all not like Kabul. There are not thousands at the gate, and people are making their way. They're being processed. We have a Border Force and Foreign Office team on the ground, and then we're loading them up. So I think there is some risk that some of the planes are not full. We've seen that in the German planes, and they've then resorted, understandably, to take some other fellow foreign personnel there if there's room. So that's what we're going to plan. We're going to plan on filling them if people turn up and processing. We are managing to process. As I'm giving this interview right now, one of the planes is loading, and there'll be another one tonight, and then there'll be a number of planes tomorrow as well. We're going to keep going, doing this, bringing people out.
I mean, people are understandably afraid because they've been being told by the British government for days it's too dangerous to leave their homes. What is your advice to them when they can hear gunfire and they're hearing reports of people being held up at checkpoints? as to how to get to the airfield safely?
Well, I mean, that's incredibly difficult. I mean, you know, every case is different. It depends where you are. So one of the reasons the diplomats and their families left was where the British Embassy was, for example, was between the two warring factions' headquarters, and some of the fighting at the time was concentrated in the sort of diplomatic quarter. And, you know, it's different in different parts of Khartoum. And there are parts of Khartoum that are not a war zone, as your journalist was reporting. So it is a case-by-case basis. It's very hard for any government to give, a bespoke advice. So what we tried to say is, you know, at the time, and as people were working out what was going on, because this is a sort of almost chaotic conflict. It's very hard to know when it's going to flare up and whether ceasefires are held. Is first of all, the advice was stay low, stay at home is one of the best things to do. But, you know, we look at the conditions on the ground and the humanitarian point that the World Food Organization was talking about. As supplies get low, obviously, the risk factor, the balance between the different types of advice of make your way out or stay home changes.
Yeah.
And then as we started to recce and understand the route, the 30-kilometre route from the centre of Khartoum to the airport, it became much clearer. Now, our advice is, originally we were going to call people forward who were, in some sense, the most vulnerable, but there's very, very little telephone and internet coverage, and that makes it therefore very hard one by one to call people forward. So we gave blanket advice. It's clear at the moment. To be fair, both the SDF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the RSF have actually been fairly helpful to both groups of people going through, holding them at checkpoints if there's been danger and letting them through, and they have been supportive.
Do you rule out sending troops to help people get out safely the way you did with the diplomats?
Well, at the moment, there's not a requirement, and the Germans didn't do that. And of course, that does change the deployment nature. If you're sending effectively troops, remember, it's a sovereign country, into the war zone to rescue people, it is possible to do, and we have the forces to do it. But at the moment, we've been finding people have been able to make their way to the airfield, but also as a sort of backup, we've been developing a Port Sudan, which, while it is a long way away, it's 500 miles on the Red Sea away from Khartoum, it is the route the UN took, and we have seen British nationals come out that way, and we've already put people there. It's a much more benign environment to be able to process them and help them on their way. So we've got a backup plan, but at the moment, and we review this all the time, the route to the airport is passable, the call has gone out, and I'm afraid it will mean, and I know the media might report on people changing their advice, it will mean that advice changes, but I think that's for the better that we advise people as things change rather than a free-for-all.
But the consequence, as you say, is that some people have made it to the border themselves and are struggling to get across the border to Egypt, sometimes without consular help. Others have gone to Port Sudan, as you say. Are you going to get ships to Port Sudan, or you've landed a plane there? Are you going to fly people out of there? What's the plan?
So in Port Sudan, we've sent HMS Lancaster, one of our naval ships, and she will be coming into port or coming alongside tomorrow. I've also directed that HMS Cardigan Bay, which is a more humanitarian ship, a Bay-class ship, starts to prepare to come from the Middle East, is already based there, to come up towards Port Sudan. And that's quite important because that has the potential to be a humanitarian platform as well, should the deteriorating circumstances on food and water continue. So we are going to put a ship there that allows all sorts of things. I've already been in touch with my Saudi counterparts because Jeddah is just across the Red Sea from Port Sudan, so we can help make sure people go there. And if necessary, we'll fly people from there direct to Cyprus. So we are being contingency. The Foreign Office is alert on those border countries to make sure we can see what we can do to support people. Ethiopia, for example, Addis Ababa is an important hub and has that stability, and I think that's important.
But I mean, just briefly on this, I mean, people are saying they've been held up at the border. People have had to sleep overnight outside because they've needed visas to get into Egypt and couldn't arrange that from Sudan. It had to be done from outside. I mean, you know, what some people are saying is the military response has been excellent. The Foreign Office response has been lacking.
Well, no, I don't agree. And I think some people imagine that the Foreign Office has a magic wand that can do things. You know, the Egyptian border is a matter for the Egyptians. You know, how they police their border is up to them. We can, of course, support people once they've crossed that border. We can help give advice. But ultimately, you know, the Egyptians keep that border quite secure, and they will take a view. And we have the same issue within Sudan. The Sudan, while there is a conflict going on, the Sudan authorities are checking passports, making decisions, and you know, when they get to the airport, whether they're British, French, German or dual national, the Sudanese authorities are taking some decisions. And you know, they may say to someone, you don't have a British passport, you can't leave the country, or you might have different requirements. So, you know, the Foreign Office can only do so much with another government on the choices it make. But look, the Foreign Office stands by to support people wherever they appear in the neighbouring countries. Obviously, some of those countries are very difficult because of the security situation within them. But I think we'll see people heading towards Ethiopia, some to Egypt. But, you know, first and foremost, the people that registered on the website or the internet about wanting to leave through the British scheme were nearly all of them were in Khartoum. So our challenge is to get them out as soon as we can.
Ben Wallace, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the history of Sudan's rebel rapid support forces has less to do with support and more with bloodshed and terror. The paramilitary group sprang from one of Africa's most widely feared militias, the Janjaweed, the armed force which was created by the Sudanese government to suppress a rebellion in Darfur 20 years ago. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, has more.
The current fighting in Khartoum has its roots in a conflict to the west of the capital 20 years ago, when the Sudanese government used extreme violence to put down a rebellion in Darfur. They burnt down villages to terrorize those they thought sympathized with the rebels. But it wasn't soldiers who committed most of the atrocities. Instead, the government employed Arab tribesmen called Janjaweed, warriors on horse or camelback, to do their dirty work. They later became the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF.
The army not only originally created the RSF, but they effectively outsourced much of the fighting in Sudan to the RSF. So the RSF was not only active in the west of Sudan in Darfur, but also in other regions that were restive.
Then President Omar al-Bashir was indicted for genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, many committed by the Janjaweed and RSF, but denied it all.
These allegations are not correct.
General Hamdan, aka Hemeti, has risen from being a Janjaweed leader to a powerful paramilitary commander. His forces are widely blamed for the killing of protesters in Khartoum in 2019. 2 years later, he worked with General Burhan in a military coup and became second in command. But he's a Frankenstein's monster who's now turned against the military who created him. It's his RSF forces manning roadblocks that Sudanese and foreigners fear as they try to escape the fighting.
The tactics that the RSF, previously the Janjaweed, deployed in Darfur and other parts of the country are the tactics that they're deploying in Khartoum. So the organization has not changed. Its tactics have not changed. They have merely become formalized and expanded under Hemeti.
The RSF has provided mercenary fighters for factions in Libya and Yemen. So has powerful foreign supporters, especially the UAE and Russia, which also have economic interests in Sudan. General Burhan is backed by Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. The West wants to reconcile the two, but while a ceasefire is desperately needed, any hope of democracy is distant. Displaced people in Darfur 2 decades ago. They were always poor and marginalized. But now conflict has moved to the capital, and the middle class is fleeing as well as foreigners. All because of a struggle between two generals, neither of whom have support amongst the Sudanese people.